Hey.
My parents are here. Surprise, surprise.
I heard something about your parents.
I heard backstage.
Hi.
Hi, everybody.
Hi, everybody who's not Matt's parents. Happy New Year. Thank you for coming. We like to just do easy conversations, so we're going to solve immigration reform tonight. Yeah, but it's going to be a civil conversation, as we promised. And it is, as you know, the great hot button issue, especially leading up to the 2020 election. So since President Trump followed through on his promise to restrict legal and illegal immigration, we have a lot to talk about tonight.
Yes. So much of what we hear about when it comes to these immigration policy changes from the White House involves the president's tweets or videos of migrants coming in from Central America. But the effects of these policies are also playing out locally. They're playing out inside the country. They're playing out here in New York and New Jersey. So to that end, we wanted to give you a little sense of what we've been working on. Beth, you've spent a lot of time covering the immigration courts here in New York. Tell us what immigration court is like in New York.
New York has the nation's biggest and busiest immigration court, and it's a real big challenge as a reporter because you're not allowed to record anything inside. And last year, to get around that, I wanted to watch all the new judges at work, and we teamed up with a courtroom sketch artist so that I could watch what I was watching and take notes, and she could draw. And I looked at all the new immigration judges, and I reported on what I was seeing, and I also spoke to immigrants about their experiences. The city's main immigration court is at Federal Plaza. It's so crowded, immigrants wait in long lines in the hallways just to enter the courtrooms. You'll meet people from Russia, Mexico, India, China, and the Caribbean. Petra Barron was crying as she tried to find her name on the calendar one morning in March. She couldn't afford a lawyer. She described the experience outside the court.
It's overwhelming, It's like you versus the immigration guy that wants to remove you. You don't know what he's gonna say.
So that was a little peek inside the court or outside of it on the street. What happens after someone loses their case? A lot of them go to jail until they get deported. And Matt, you've reported on that.
Yeah, immigrants who are arrested in New York or New Jersey by Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, they end up, most of them, the vast majority of them end up at 3 county jails in New Jersey. I've reported on the conditions there, and controversies there, everything from excessive use of solitary confinement to rancid food. But the thing is, these counties, which are run by Democrats, they get a ton of money from ICE to hold these immigrants, and that's caused a lot of controversy in the counties who don't want these Democrats to keep detaining people for ICE. And the Democrats who run the counties say they rely on this money, and it helps them keep taxes down. So here's a snippet of a story I did about why some Democrats want to keep their ICE contracts and keep detaining immigrants in county jails. This is Anthony Verneri. He's a Democratic official in Hudson County, and he speaks to the reason why the counties want this revenue from ICE.
If we didn't have the contract, our facility would be probably a third of the population. We'd have to do layoffs.
100 corrections officers, many of them Hudson County residents, including women and people of color, would be laid off. And not just that. An analysis from the county says if the contract with ICE is scrapped, taxes would go up to the tune of more than $11 million a year.
We'll be hurting our own staff, and we'll be hurting our own county families. That's the bottom line.
I think that gets a little bit to the nuance of this issue and the complexities of this issue. Under political pressure, Hudson County did say that they will stop detaining immigrants by the end of this year, but as far as we know, that has not happened yet. Still, the political pressure is mounting, and these counties, remember, these counties actually detained immigrants before Trump was president, but the pressure has gotten a lot more significant since he was elected, and it's in part because of the controversy surrounding the president's other immigration policies. And there might be no other immigration policy more controversial than family separation, separating kids from their parents at the border. And Beth, you've reported on how that has played out not just at the border, but locally.
Yeah, a lot of the kids who were separated from their parents at the border ended up being sent to New York City and the New York region because we have a lot of agencies that have contracts with the federal government to take them and put them in foster care. And the family separation policy was supposed to stop in 2018, but I met 3 sisters from Honduras who were taken from their father at the border afterward because he had HIV, and the government considered that a communicable disease. The girls told me they didn't understand this because their father was not sick when they last saw him. The three sisters say their father did not need to be hospitalized and was healthy because he took his medicine. 13-year-old Leliana was angry when she later learned they were separated based on her dad's HIV status. They told us about that argument, she says, but I don't know what that disease has to do with us. Leliana pauses, embarrassed to say the word sex. Her older sister Andrea pipes in.
They're supposed to help him, not to send him back to Honduras.
Their dad was deported, and the kids are still here in New York City with family members. The government actually admitted that this was a mistake. We hear a lot of sad cases covering immigration. Matt, you've covered a lot of refugee stories.
I've reported on refugees here in our area, but I also went to Japan to report on how this issue and these immigration questions and challenges are playing out similarly all around the world. So I went to Japan to try to put some context on this. Now, in Japan, just 42 asylum seekers in 2018 were given permission to stay, were given official refugee status, but there were more than 10,000 applicants. So their immigration system is a lot more restrictive than it is here. And I met asylum seekers from all over the world there. We're going to hear from Rose from Cameroon in Central Africa. She fled to Japan, but her story indicates how hard it is to get asylum anywhere, in Japan or the U.S. When Rose got to Tokyo, she landed in Tokyo. She had to leave because there's a civil war brewing in Cameroon, and she was attacked at a protest. So she lands at Tokyo, and she eventually meets with a refugee advocate about her case, and she thinks she's going to be able to stay. But then she's told she has almost no chance of being allowed to stay. And this was Rose's reaction when she heard this news that her asylum claim would probably be denied.
Why won't they believe that people are truly in danger? Why won't they believe that people are running for their lives?
So you were shocked when you
I was shocked. I was speechless. And I was very, very disappointed.
Rose is facing what immigrants everywhere are facing, and that's more and more people are on the move because of violence and poverty. They're fleeing their nations, and there are just fewer and fewer places to find safety. And that's the crux of what the U.S. is grappling with now as we try to, quote unquote, fix our immigration system. But of course, as we know, Democrats and Republicans don't agree at all on immigration policy, and they seem more divided than they ever have.
And that's why we're going to spend tonight looking at solutions, because in some ways they're not so divided. There is that old word bipartisanship. It seems so last century, but there are areas where Democrats and Republicans do agree that the problems we've been reporting on here are signs of a broken system. They agree on that. But while they may not agree on every solution, you may be surprised to learn that there are some immigration reforms that Democrats and Republicans do agree on. They've just been stuck, and for a lot longer than you may think. So I'd like to introduce our first guest tonight. Her name is Lenny Benson. She's a professor at New York Law School. She's been teaching and writing in the field of immigration law since 1994. She also runs the Safe Passage Project, which recruits, trains, and mentors lawyers and students to represent young immigrants in court. Lenny is a real expert on immigration history, and she's here to tell us about the different ways people can come and stay here legally. And she's been looking at the past 30 years in particular, and she's going to tell us what she's learned. So let's welcome Lenny.
Thanks, Beth. I don't think I've ever had entry music before. Thank you, everyone, for coming out. I've been given 6 minutes. I can cover 100 plus years of immigration history in 6 minutes, no problem. Let's take a look at this image. This is a metaphor of our population. I've made it a pool with different layers, and those deep layers may be our indigenous populations, our history, our past waves of migrants, our forced migration. But what I want to focus on today is to look at who are the foreign-born in our country today. Because we really can't have a conversation about immigration reform unless we know a little bit about who comes to the country lawfully and what is our unauthorized population as well. So the country has about 325 million people, and of that 325 million people, there are 44 million who are foreign-born. That's about 13.6%. That's approaching an all-time high in the country. But you might be surprised to learn that there are many nations in the world that have a higher percentage of foreign-born. Germany, for example, is over 14%. And then there's countries like the UAE where the percentage is over 70% of foreign-born. It's a complicated topic, but let's break down the number a little bit more. Of the foreign-born, the 44 million, 44% have already naturalized to become U.S. citizens. So let's take a look at who are the remaining foreign-born in our society. Of that 55% that's left, we're looking at 24.2 million people. I'm using the best, most recent available data from 2017, and I want to thank the Pew Research Center for the data. Of that, the majority are people who are here lawfully. Those are people with green cards, people with student visas, people with long-term work visas, people with an authorized period of stay. We still do have a large percentage of people who are undocumented or unauthorized. They may have entered without permission, or they may have remained after an authorized period. And that's 3.1% of our total population. About 10 million people, 10.5 million. Is that a big number or a little number? Well, it may depend what community you're living in and how your community is experiencing it. But I think we have to stop and recognize that in a country of 325 million, 3.1% is not an overwhelming issue. This is a snapshot, an annual snapshot. These are the categories, the first four that you see, moving from the left. These are the legal immigrant pathways. So since 1965 and expanded in 1990, Congress has prioritized close family relationships. If you are married to a U.S. citizen, or the child of a U.S. citizen, or even the parent of a U.S. citizen, provided that citizen's over 21, you have a fast path to immigration in some ways. But if you're a brother and sister, it may be many, many years before you could be sponsored. Nevertheless, that's our biggest pool of immigrants every year, family reunification. The next group, and this is, I'm calling it humanitarian, but it's a mashup of a lot of different categories. The refugees we bring to the country, the people who come and knock on the door and ask for asylum, whether affirmatively stepping forward or as defense in immigration court, those who are victims of crime that have been certified, those who are victims of trafficking, and a very small group who've been here a very long time and have been by statute given permission to remain. Next, we have employment. Congress caps the employment category at 140,000 people a year. You might be interested for you to know that about 60% of those numbers are spouses and children of the sponsored workers. We have a backlog in some worker categories, and others we have no backlog at all. And then there's the diversity lottery. You've probably heard about it. It was designed because the 1965 law, which removed some of the country quotas and removed some of the hemisphere quotas, did, however, prioritize existing family relationships or employment sponsorship. So Congress in 1990 said, we're going to also allow people from low-sending countries to compete in a random lottery. The countries that most often get visas from this lottery, it is random, but in the last 15 years of data, we could say it's Nigeria, Ethiopia, Egypt, closely followed by the Ukraine and Albania. Now, what about the undocumented? Is it a high number or a low number? I picked 2017 because it was a record number of people arriving primarily from Central America, as you heard in the story a few minutes ago. 396,000 people apprehended by Customs and Border Patrol at the southwest border. But the vast majority of these people are quickly processed through something called expedited removal. They may or may not see an immigration judge, and they're deported. We also, though, have people who entered lawfully with a tourist visa, a student visa, a visa waiver from a country like England or Ireland or Singapore. And we have about 340,000 of those people annually who overstay their visa. Now, you remember my image was of a pool because migrant flows go in and out well. We have immigrants constantly leaving the United States. We have people who overstay a visa, stay 3 extra months, 6 months and leave. We have people who migrated here who choose to return. So it is a constant changing mass of people. Let's take a look at some of the immigration laws of the past a little bit more deeply. I've already mentioned we expanded the law in 1990 to create the diversity lottery to raise the employment ceiling to 140,000 people, or less than 0.01% of our working population, and to expand the family categories. But we also, in 1996, had a major immigration law. And in that law, Congress created punishments. If you violated your status or entered illegally or returned after a deportation, you could be subject to a 3-year bar, a 10-year bar, or a lifetime bar. The impact of that, and most demographers completely agree on this, is that people got stuck. They stayed frozen where they were, whereas in the past, before the 96 law, you might travel home, pick up an employment-based visa, a family visa, and return. Now you're stuck. So how do we fix the stuck? The people who are out of status and want a path to regular status. In 1986 was our biggest reform, so this slide illustrates 3 pathways from the Immigration Reform and Control Act. It was a law that took 20 years to create. It was bipartisan. It's not a political issue of Democrat or Republican. We had people on both sides of the parties joining it. Let's look at Registry first. This has been part of our law since 1929, updated in 1940, again in 1958, updated in 1986. It's a provision that allows you to come forward, apply for status, get a green card. If you're a person of good moral character, you pay your taxes, you don't have any serious convictions. The current date, you had to enter before January 1st, 1972. We are way out of date for updating our registry date. The other 2 main provisions of the 86 law, besides creating employer sanctions, were to give a pathway for agricultural workers. Basically, if you could show you worked 90 days over 3 years in agriculture, and 1.1 million people legalized that way. And then the bigger legalization of 1.6 million. Although at the time, there were predictions as high as 20 million people, if you entered before 1/1/82, you had a multi-year path to permanent residence. So these are examples of past reforms in 1986. We really haven't had a comprehensive immigration bill succeed in Congress. The closest we came, perhaps one could say, was a Senate bill that passed in 2013. 68 senators, that's more than 2/3, ratified a bill sometimes called the Gang of 8 bill because it was both Republicans and Democrats that came together. It had 3 main components: enhanced border controls, expanding guest worker categories, and a 14-year path of coming out of the shadows and applying for status. The bill was never heard in the House, despite Speaker Boehmer's statements that he would schedule it for hearing. It was never heard in any committee, nor brought before the legislature. Since that time, Congress has been reluctant to approach with comprehensive reforms. Some of the speakers tonight will talk about this middle approach, the sector trade-offs. A small group passing a small piece of legislation, perhaps as part of an appropriations bill that will protect one group. Others tonight will talk about deferred action for childhood arrivals, a discretionary program, and the DREAM Act. Why hasn't that become part of the law with Congress? The rolling registry date up in the far left, that is the provision that most academics and most countries approve of. Basically, if you've been here 14, 15 years and you have good character, you come forward, you get status, you become part of our society and on a path to citizenship. And then the last one I wanted to mention, because it's really a hot topic right now, is some response to climate change. We don't have a category of humanitarian visa or a pathway to immigration for those adversely affected by climate. Given the United States consumes more energy than most world, like 50% of the world's energy, maybe we have a moral or political obligation. Senator Markey in Massachusetts has recently introduced an approach, a discretionary bill that would allow about 50,000 climate victims to immigrate to the United States. Well, that was a little over 6 minutes. That just put our toe into the complex pool that is immigration. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. I just had one very quick follow-up question for you because we're looking at solutions tonight. You had mentioned the agriculture workers. Were there any states that tried programs over the past few years, like their own state solutions to keep certain types of workers?
Well, there has been a movement for a long time, actually, it just hasn't gotten much ground, that agribusiness in particular would like to have additional guest workers, but with a path to permanent status. They don't want to be really, truly too exploitative. And recently we saw that a member of Congress from Utah introduced a bill that would use this approach. And really, in Iowa in 2000, they had a Blue Ribbon Commission that said we should have a state-based approach, not just for workers, but also for skilled workers, because we have brain drain leaving some of our Midwestern states. And so immigration is often, whether it's good or bad, is in the eye of your community. And I think we'll hear more about that tonight.
Great. Well, thank you so much.
Okay, before we hear from our next guest, we thought we'd do a little game. Yeah. There's no prizes, though, just so you know. But we'd like you to participate anyway. Beth and I do a lot of fact-checking as part of our job. There's, you won't be surprised to know, a lot of misinformation about immigration out there. So we have a few questions that we've come across in our beat that we would like to see if you know the answers to. We're going to keep this simple, so we'll ask you a question, and we'll all find out if you're an immigration expert. Beth, you want to start?
Sure. All right. In his first 3 years in office, this president deported almost 1.2 million immigrants. Who was it? Raise your hand if you think it was Donald Trump. Oh, wait, we have a smart crowd. And who thinks it was Barack Obama? Ah, talk about preaching to the choir. Yes, it was Obama. He deported those immigrants as a way of looking tough on illegal immigration to try to get a comprehensive deal on immigration reform with the Republicans, which didn't happen.
Okay, under this president, the number of detained immigrants tripled. Raise your hand if it was Donald Trump. A few hands. And who thinks it might have been Bill Clinton? The answer, please. Bill Clinton. The immigration detention system, as we know it today, was really created under the Clinton presidency.
Okay, next. Which former New York City mayor said this? We're not going to hear it, obviously. Undocumented immigrants should be able to seek medical help without the threat of being reported, possibly deported. He went on to say they could possibly become a danger to public health if they were not able to seek health care services. Anyone want to guess what mayor said it? What?
Bloomberg. Someone said Bloomberg.
Bloomberg. All right.
Koch.
All right. All right. All right. Well, here's.
Someone said Rudy over here.
All right. Let's see who it was.
There he is.
That guy.
Is he still in the news at all?
I don't know what's happened to him.
Okay, one last question. This is a true or false one. The president's border wall so far costs as much as a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier. True or false? I got a false. Someone heard it on WNYC. That's right. That's where I heard it too. The answer is true. The president's border wall so far costs $11 billion, billion with a B. All right. Well, thank you for playing. Speaking of true and false, our next speaker works at a think tank, which has all the true data on immigration. Muzaffar Chishti is a lawyer and director of the Migration Policy Institute's office at New York University School of Law. His work focuses on U.S. immigration policy at the federal, state, and local levels. Welcome, Moose.
Hi, good evening. My job, at least in this segment, is to just present facts to inform the discussion that will come later. Now, these are not Republican facts or Democratic facts, and since we're having a civil conversation, I would like to say these are civil facts. No matter whether you are bullish on immigration or you're skeptical about immigration, these do inform. Where's the clicker? Okay. These do inform the policy debate on immigration. And let me begin by the first basic slide. We like to think of ourselves as a nation of immigrants. We have never been more a nation of immigrants. We like to think of the first decade of the 20th century as the era of mass migration. And at the end of that decade, Congress, for the first time, put quantitative limits on immigration and kept national origin quotas, giving huge preference to Western and Northern European countries at the expense of Southern and Eastern European countries and the rest of the world. That happened in the beginning of the 20th century, considered the high watermark of immigration. We are again at a high watermark of immigration. Today, the foreign-born population in the United States is about 45.4 million, and that, as you will see in this slide, is about 14.1% of the US population. In terms of per capita, that is not the highest watermark. The highest watermark goes back to the beginning of the 20th century when it was 15% of the population. So in absolute numbers, the highest; in relative per capita number, not the highest. The next thing, important facts about immigration, is that this is not a national phenomenon. Immigrants don't settle equally in all parts of the country. We used to call the 6 states that you see at the left column, California to Illinois, as the traditional receiving states of the country. They still are the dominant places of settlement in the United States for immigrants. These 6 states, from California to Illinois, take still about 66% of all people who settle in the United States. Only in the last 3 or 4 years have we added 4 additional states. I like to call this the Millionaires Club. These are states which at least take 1 million, and now these 10 states account for 73% of the population. Really, about 2 years ago, Virginia and Washington were not even on the list. So this is, but still, a highly concentrated phenomenon in settlement. The next fact important is that, as my demographer colleagues always like to say, it's not the absolute numbers that matter, it's the rate of change. If you look at since 1990, where the big rate of change has happened is not on the traditional receiving states of the country, it's in North Carolinas to Indianas of the world, where their foreign-born population has increased by about 270%. Next important fact is, where are these people coming from? Now, in 1965, we repealed the national origin quota system, giving up the discrimination that had become the hallmarks of immigration policy from 1921 to 1965. Today, if you therefore look at the countries of origin, these are the countries of origin from Mexico to Guatemala. If you look at the countries in 1965 where we took immigrants from, these are almost all European countries. Not surprisingly, the only country that is common to both these lists is Mexico. If you look at immigration in 1965, 85% of our immigration was European or Canadian. Today, 85% of our immigration is non-European or Canadian. Whatever your view on race is, it's difficult to think that that does not play somewhere in the politics on immigration. The next important fact slide, which I want to show, is sort of partly what Lenny just referenced to. If you look at the pie chart of all the total foreign-born population in the United States today, one remarkable factor of this, compared to all chapters of history, is that 1/4 of these are unauthorized. That has never been true in the history of our country. The good thing about this chart is that slice would have shown about 1/3 were unauthorized, even if I gave the spiel about 10 years ago. So the number of unauthorized has gone down, but is still 25% of the population. And most importantly, if you look at states in the country where at least 30% of the foreign-born population is unauthorized, there are 14 such states, from Arkansas to New Mexico. All of these states except one, 13 out of these 14 states voted for Trump in the last election. The next important thing, which I just referenced, is that the good news is that there has been a decline in an unauthorized population since 2008, when we went from the peak of 12.2 Today, it's about 10.5 million. Most of it has to do with changes in the patterns of migration from Mexico, which we can get into the discussion later. But the fact is that we have fewer unauthorized people in the country today than we had 10 years ago. The important part of the unauthorized population of the 10.5 we are here is that they are here for a long period of time. About 62% of the unauthorized population have lived here for more than 10 years. If you look at the unauthorized who lived here for more than 5 years, it's about 82% of the population. So when people say, why don't we just deport these people, we have to think about these are people with deep roots in the communities, and so uprooting them would obviously be at a significant, huge social and economic cost to those communities. And the fact that sort of pulls all heartstrings all the time is that there are 5.1 million kids in the U.S. where at least one member of the household is unauthorized. And of these, about more than 4 million people are U.S. born and therefore U.S. citizens at birth. Therefore, if we talk about let's deport these people, we have to deal with the specter of removing 4 million U.S. citizens along with the parents. This is about the basic demographic trend. Quickly, what's the story with the labor force? About 17, if you look at today's numbers, about 17% of the U.S. civilian labor force is foreign-born. And this kind of spectrum on the two ends, low wage and high wage. They are highly concentrated in the low-wage sector. If you look at sectors of the economy which require less than a high school education, 53% of that is foreign-born. So, but you also look at the high-end occupations, 17% are foreign-born. If you just look at our Nobel Prize winners since 2000, 40% of our Nobel Prize winners in physics, chemistry, and medicine since year 2000 have been foreign-born. So it's at the end, both ends of the spectrum, and we have immigrants concentrated. And if you 5% of the total U.S. force in 2016 was unauthorized. Now, very quickly before we get to the discussion which follows, it is what is responsible for this huge level of migrants in the labor force and in the population. And we have not enough time, but let me just tick off 4 factors. One is sort of the state of the labor market. Now, we have obviously gone from a manufacturing society when we used to employ a large number of less than high school educated people. Now, manufacturing we have lost. There's gone abroad. Either globalization has been responsible for that, lack of unionization has been responsible for that. So the big growth is now in the low-wage sector, especially in the service sector of our economy, from elder care to infant care to child care to janitorial services to the farms and the construction industry, hotels and resorts. That's where good part of our labor market demand comes from. And so therefore that's been reflected in the demand for foreign workers. The second most important factor is that we have become an aging society. We are fast getting the trappings of Europe and Japanese societies. It's not a shock to any one of you here today that of the 78 million baby boomers, all will turn 55 this year, in 2020. There are 10,000 baby boomers who retire a day. By the year 2035, all of the baby boomers would have turned more than 65. Demographers have pointed out to this very important pivotal point that will happen in 2035. For the first time in 2035, the number of people in this country who will be over the age of 65 will be more than the number of people under the age of 18. So these are obviously things that have consequences in society in terms of how do we support a social security system, how do we support the need for the labor force, where immigration becomes an important factor. And the other important, the last one, on the third one, is that we've also become a more educated society. In the beginning of the 20th century, only 10% Americans graduated high school. Today, 85% Americans graduate high school. That's obviously good for the society. But it has implications in the labor market, that if you're a high school graduate, your ambition is not to flip hamburgers for the rest of your life. And that is also creating, obviously, the need for foreign workers who fill that gap. And the last point I want to make, the responsible for this is the question to someone like me would be, if all this is true, then, why are all these people coming illegally? Why don't we just take them legally if we need them? This is where we get into our outdated dysfunctional immigration selection system. For our immigration selection system today, we have a 1952 architecture for a 21st century global economy. If you look at how many people we admit today, there are only 5,000 visas for green cards available for people with low skills. That just doesn't pass the LAF test. And if you look at even the number of categories that we have people allowed to come on the family-based and on the employment-based, the wait lists sometimes are as long as 23 years if you're a brother and sisters of someone coming from Philippines. Even if you are an employment-based, sponsored by the IBMs of the world. If you're from China and India, it may take you 11 years or 8 years to get a green card. So this is sort of what we generally like to call the broken immigration system, responsible for the dysfunction that we face in the immigration world today, and that's led to the politics that we'll, I think, soon discuss. Thank you.
Thank you, Moose. You can stay. You can sit right next to me over there. Yes, sit. Right over there. Perfect. Okay, now we're going to hear from a panel of experts. That was fascinating. We appreciate it. We have two other experts joining us. Please welcome Casey Christine Higgins and Rachel Salazar. So we chose three people who either work in the field of immigration law or know a lot about national politics or both. And remember, we want to take your questions afterwards. There'll be mics set up. So after this panel, we'd love to hear some questions from the audience. Moose, you just heard from him. He's sticking around. Casey Christine Higgins is next to Beth over there. She's based in Washington, D.C. Thank you for making the trip up today. She has nearly a decade of experience serving in the U.S. House of Representatives. She was responsible for advising former Speaker Paul Ryan and the Republican leadership, mostly in immigration and trade, and she's currently an immigration fellow at the Bipartisan Policy Center. Rachel Salazar is in the middle there. She's the supervising attorney for the New Jersey Detention and Deportation Defense Initiative. Through Legal Services of New Jersey, she represents immigrants detained in New Jersey who are in deportation proceedings. And she previously represented detained immigrants at the Legal Aid Society in New York City, which was the first universal representation project for detained immigrants in the country. Thank you to everybody for being here. Beth, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, so especially since both Lenny and Moose referred to how we're so stuck right now and that the system is outdated, it seems like employment is one area where there could be bipartisan cooperation. Casey, tell us what you think about the work visas, because there's ceilings on how many people can come from each country that are considered outdated by both Republicans and Democrats, right? So what proposals are there for that?
Yeah, so I think this has been a long-standing issue overall, that you've got Republicans and Democrats in the middle, so you're going to take your extremes and put them to the side. But Republicans and Democrats in the middle want to increase visa numbers, especially right now when we have very low unemployment numbers. You need more labor. And as our economy changes and advances and develops, you particularly need more labor in areas like construction workers or in agriculture in particular. That's one area where there's a lot of bipartisan support. Unfortunately, your extremes on both sides tend to make this a zero-sum game in terms of never increasing the visa numbers. So we like to do little gimmicky things in our legislation, like exempt certain people from the caps and things like that. But I think, especially given how strong the economy is right now, there is a growing consensus that we need to increase some of these numbers. And right now you're seeing some legislation. It's called Fairness for High-Skilled Immigrants Act that has passed the House. It's in the Senate. They're trying to get it through. And what that would do was remove per-country caps on the employment-based visas. So right now there is a ceiling of 15%. So if you're from China, once you hit that 15% of the overall visa caps, you got to wait until the next year. So this would remove the per-country caps and create a first-in-line system. But one of the objections to this legislation and why it hasn't been able to get through is that at the end of the day, you need more visas. This isn't a solution that changes the numbers. It just creates a system to work a little bit differently. So
Would that be for all sectors, for all jobs, or would it be preferential for certain, like agriculture, places where there's a greater need?
Sure. So this is for green card visas. So immigrant visas, not non-immigrant visas.
Okay,
Most of your agriculture and other things are guest worker programs, so they're not permanent. This is for employment-based visas. That it would remove the cap, and then on your family-based visas, it would actually decrease the per-country cap from 15% down to 7%. So you'd still have that cap, but it's lowered.
But there's a per-country cap for the employment-based visas, right?
Correct. Yes. So that would be eliminated under this legislation.
Which would benefit countries like India?
India and China. Yes. In the short term, ultimately, it's gonna, like I said, it'll create a first-in-line system that once you're in the queue, once your number's up, there you go.
So are both Democrats and Republicans pretty much in agreement on that, or where do you see that going? Is that something that could happen before the next election?
Yeah, it's interesting. So there's a lot of these small ball immigration bills. This is very technical. This isn't a huge overhaul of the immigration system where there is a lot of strong bipartisan support. A similar piece of legislation actually passed the House back in the 107th Congress. We tried to move it last year and or I should say last Congress, and just kind of ran out of time. So it's come back now. There's a bunch of these small ball bills that are very broadly bipartisan. So this passed the House with at least 2/3 majority. It ran under suspension. I think there were probably a few defections, but not many. So there are a lot of these little bills that have broad bipartisan support.
Would they have to be tied up to a bigger package, though? Moose, what do you think?
Well, this is the perennial debate. This is why immigration thing hasn't happened, is that everyone is opposed to something.
Yeah.
In the immigration bill. So put this in perspective, first of all, as I said, our basic immigration law was written in 1952. Really, the only time we have tinkered with legal immigration in terms of how many numbers, how we could change numbers is 1990. That's now pretty close to 30 years ago. Now, if you would ask people that we change interest rates in our country every quarter, but we don't change levels of immigration for 30 years. That just doesn't make sense.
But Casey sounds very optimistic. Are you? Do you think that?
Well, we have been optimistic for the last, 20 years.
That's true. That's true.
And, and there's reason why it doesn't happen, which we'll come to soon. But I think at some level, the basic discussion is, should we enlarge the pie? Right now, we take pretty close to, despite whatever we think about Trump and whether he has completely clamped down on immigration, we still take 1 million people a year on green cards. We have to just report that out. The issue is that should we increase that 1 million to something else, to a little more, which is what Congress did in 2013 slightly, and how that pie should be distributed. Right now, I think most people agree that the number of green cards allotted for employment-based immigration is just not enough for the 21st, especially for the low-wage sectors that they come. It's just 5,000. It just doesn't make sense. So I think there is consensus that we should increase employment-based visas. The difficulty is, should these people, if we need people to work, should they come as permanent members of the society on green cards, or should they come as temporary workers? And once you get into that debate, that gets into all the history about Bracero program and exploitation and all that. I think that's part of what the edge in the debate is. But I think there's a lot of consensus that we should increase employment-based immigration. Then I think there's this debate that has now come to fore only the last year, that even if you increase employment-based immigration, do you still keep per-country ceilings? The per-country ceilings today create a huge backlog for China and India. The fact is, if you lift it, then just by the force of demography, all our immigration based on employment may be confined to China and India. Is that good for the country? Would we be all happy that all our new seed immigrants come from India and China? And that's, I think, which has also sort of been a stumbling block here.
Okay. Another area where I know that both of you have shared with me, and it shouldn't be any news, is that Democrats and Republicans have pretty much broad consensus that they like the DACA recipients, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrival, kids who came with their parents and were here illegally for a long time, and until President Obama made this executive order that they can stay if they stay out of trouble and they can work legally. But yet there is still no deal to keep them, and DACA is tied up right now in the Supreme Court. Do any of you here think that should the Supreme Court rule that DACA was illegal for the Trump administration or against the Trump administration, say DACA is legal in the spring, would that force the parties to come to some agreement about DACA? Could it be done before the election?
Well, it will have to be done before the election.
Has to?
Yeah. I mean, the DACA is one issue on which all three branches of our government have kicked the can as far as they could. Really. I mean, Congress did not pass DACA. President Obama finally thought he had no choice and did administrative relief, and 800,000 people got relief out of that. President Trump stopped DACA, but basically told Congress, look, this is your job to do. Congress didn't do it. And Congress didn't do it because it was then stuck in the courts, so they were off the hook. Finally, I think Chief Justice Roberts tried to prevent ruling on this as long as he could. Finally, there was no choice. There will be a decision at the end of the term, and the issue at that time will be if the termination of DACA was legal, then all these people lose status. Then people will have to make the moral choice. Do we let 800,000 people be susceptible to deportation? And I think there is a lot of consensus that's probably not going to happen. So something will have to happen either by Congress doing it or they sending it back to the administration to do it. The issue is going to be if Congress gives relief to DACA kids, will it come with something else, like a corresponding enforcement measure on border control or interior enforcement?
Great,
so it'll be to and fro there.
Casey, do you agree? I mean, in order for the DACA recipients, 650,000 of them now, to remain, would the Democrats have to give up something?
Yes. So it was interesting. In 2018, we thought that the Supreme Court might take up this case. And there was a huge push to try to get together and find some compromise before that happened, because on either side of the aisle, you obviously don't want to pull the rug out from underneath these folks. At the end of the day, there was a lot of push to do a very simple DACA border deal that avoids getting into a lot of the details, because the very difficult part about DACA is not whether or not to protect them, it's how to work out how that program works. It's things like how you make sure that they were in the country for the set period of time, the anti-fraud measures, things like that. When you start to get into those details, that's where you have a problem. And I think there is obviously both sides of the aisle that play politics with this issue, but you're going to have a Supreme Court decision, and ultimately you don't have the political bandwidth before the election to navigate all the sticky details of what are the enforcement pieces that go with this. How do we work this program? How many Dreamers are covered by this program? Is it just the current DACA recipients, or are we going to grow the pie? Which I think there's broad consensus on both sides of the aisle to do, but how do you do that? And I think, we wrote language in 2018 that we intended to try to trade with the Democrats with a little border piece to move on, and they didn't want to talk to us about it at that time, but it simply directed the Secretary of Homeland Security to continue the program per the 2012 memo until X date. So we knew we had a deadline, presumably, if the Supreme Court was going to rule. It's a Band-Aid that kicks you after the election, buys you some political space to maneuver, but also creates a deadline for Congress to act, because Congress loves a deadline, and until we have one staring us in the face. But it's a good question about the enforcement, too, because this DACA is going to be the impetus to act on something big that we haven't done recently. Everybody else is going to want to hitch a ride on that piece of legislation when it starts moving. So it's just a matter of what the bandwidth is at that point.
I'm sorry, you want Rachel, please.
I just wanted to add really quickly that it's important. I think the general public may think of the Supreme Court ruling on DACA as part of this political process, but I think it's important to emphasize that the Supreme Court's role in this should not be, it shouldn't be driven by political concerns. So, the Supreme Court's going to do what it's going to do, but as lawyers, I think a lot of us are looking at the case and saying, well, it's really ironic that Trump took the position that Obama didn't have the right to give DACA, yet Trump is saying, I have the executive authority to take it back. So I think what the Supreme Court decides could have a real impact on executive power in the immigration arena, and it's something to pay attention to as a precedent for future actions relating to immigration.
I wanted to ask you, well, stay with you, Rachel, for a moment, because you represent immigrants in detention, and maybe this is another area that could get handled in the immediate term, one of these small ball issues. What issues do you see every day with immigrants who are detained that you think there could be bipartisan agreement to address? Maybe in terms of the kinds of people, the communities of people that ICE is going after, is arresting, is prioritizing, and then maybe in terms of the conditions in which they're kept.
Thank you. That's a great question. And I also want to say thanks for inviting me to be part of this panel, because the reality of what's happening in detention and in immigration courts, where immigration judges are severely rushed to make, life-altering decisions for individuals and families, is pretty shocking and not always known to people generally. For me, as an attorney, I've just seen a gross deprivation of due process, both in terms of custody, an immigrant's ability to even get a bond and bond out to be able to fight his or her case from outside, versus being stuck in these detention centers where there's very little oversight or accountability, where people are dying because they're not getting the medical attention that they need. That it's become more more obvious that there needs to be more judicial oversight over both detention of immigrants and over removal proceedings. I mean, the legal problem that we're stuck with is that immigration judges who are part of an administrative agency under the executive branch they're being deprived of their autonomy, their independence. They're being pushed to deport people en masse, to not respect even the rights or the due process rights that are even afforded under the Immigration and Naturalization Act. We're seeing judges rush through cases without interpreters, respondents not knowing what's happening when they're being ordered deported, because the hearing is not being fully interpreted. Sometimes they'll be given a summary which lost, everything, and maybe except for the final decision. And these people who've just been dealt a life-changing decision don't even know what happened. They're also oftentimes appearing by televideo and not even there in person. It's just become a very dehumanizing process that perhaps can only be fixed if immigration court becomes an Article I court with more independence and judicial oversight. Similarly, in Massachusetts recently, a district court judge decided that the laws relating to immigrants' custody, as immigration judges have been applying them, have grossly deprived respondents of their due process rights and their right to liberty, and as a result, in immigration courts in Massachusetts, the burden has now shifted to the government to prove that they should be held on bond, and that any amount of bond over $1,500 or conditions of release is not appropriate. Whereas now, under the Immigration and Nationality Act, we're seeing individuals who don't even speak English go into court and are held to to the burden of showing that they're not a danger or flight risk and don't even understand the evidence that they're supposed to produce, and are just stuck in jail.
Casey, are there proposals to improve the rights of these or of those who are not otherwise citizens or not otherwise documented to be here, or to improve their due process rights, to at least give them a chance to argue their case before a human being as opposed to a video screen?
There are two, generally speaking. One is that why do we detain people? But we kind of forget that detention is not a punishment. It's not in the criminal justice system. You send people to jail because they have committed a crime. Here, most people are in detention just to make sure they show up for the hearing. And that, people should understand. So there are alternatives to detention to make sure people can show up for hearing. You can, put them in touch with community-based organizations like Rachel's, and they will guarantee people will show up. People you could put electronic monitors. I mean, it's not ideal, but it's better than jail. So there are alternatives to detention which should be considered. Second thing is that, I think the point Rachel made is that our immigration court is basically part of the Department of Justice. They are all immigration judges, they're called judges, are employees of the Attorney General. And Attorney General can actually decide to reject a decision by Board of Immigration Appeals just because he or she doesn't like it. This administration has done record number of those things. That process has to change. Independence has to be established, whether it's Article 1 court or some other means for judges to be independent. And last thing is that there should be increased representation by lawyers in these proceedings. All studies show that when immigrants are represented by lawyers, the chances of success hugely increase.
But they don't have a right to.
They have right to counsel. They don't have a right to appointed by the government.
Because it's civil,
Because
not
it's civil
criminal.
proceeding in Article.
So
And
you
there
don't
should
have
be
an
some
automatic free
change,
attorney.
given how consequential deportation is. It's important for us as a country to come to terms with that and see whether there should be either government-appointed counsel or counsel provided by not-for-profits who could be funded by the government or foundations.
Casey, could
Casey,
you see?
And we're going to take some questions
Yeah.
after. I'd like to get Casey involved, and then if anybody has questions, feel free to line up at the mics on either side, because I think after Casey, we should probably take some audience questions. Sorry, Casey, go ahead.
That's okay.
I think I also called you Christine earlier.
Oh, that's okay. Either one works.
It is your middle name.
My dad calls me Christine when I'm in trouble. So, no, I think that there is broad bipartisan support surrounding. There's understanding that our immigration courts are overrun and the system is not working. It's part of why family separation happened, because they were trying to force Congress to act. I think, quick sidebar, the overwhelming reason for all this executive action is Congress's failure to act. And because we have failed to do anything about any of these issues for so long, whether it was, it started with the UAC crisis in 2014.
Unaccompanied children.
thank
Crossing the
you.
border.
But we throw money at the problem, but the best we can do is throw money out, and we haven't been able to really come together and reform the system in a way that works. But I do think that there's broad bipartisan support in terms of increasing immigration judges, increasing resources to the immigration courts. But I do also believe that those of us in Washington, policymakers, don't have this on-the-ground experience. At the firm I work at, I talk to our actual immigration lawyers all the time when I'm thinking about a policy idea, because we aren't in the courtrooms, we aren't dealing with this on the ground on a daily basis. And what Washington needs to do better, especially in this space, is talk to people like Rachel and say, what are you encountering? Let's get creative about how to do this. And it's going to take a while, but there should be a big congressional initiative. Also, I'm from Wisconsin, so what people are experiencing along the border in Texas and Arizona and whatnot is not necessarily something I was familiar with when I went out to Washington. Every single time I went to the border, I learned tons of things that you can't learn unless you're actually there. And that's another important piece too, is not just talking to experts, but also going to the border, going to the courts, experiencing things for yourselves. Not just at a staff level, but at a member level. And I hope that's something that we can do, because there is broad bipartisan support in this space.
Thanks. Does anybody have any questions for our panelists? Feel free to come up to the mic. Come on up.
Yes, hi.
Hi there.
Christine, this is a question for you. My name's Christina. Hello. I grew up in Indiana, moved out to New Jersey about 3 years ago. Something I kind of noticed was what we're talking about, this bipartisan concept, the dichotomy between the left and the right. and the way we see immigration in those ways, where a lot of the left out here and on the coastal societies tends to see immigration as a very positive thing, where a lot of in the middle of the country, aka also a lot of the right, tends to see immigration as a very negative concept, where a lot of this issue with being able to pass these policies stems from this massive disagreement between these two parties, and it seems like such a big issue. I mean, we can talk about policy and the intricacies of laws and things like that, which can go over a lot of people's heads, but how do we start to combat the very basics of the sociological concepts of immigration to begin with, the very basic nature of immigration bad versus immigration good? Like, how do we get past those aspects of things?
It's a great question. I think, in my experience, the biggest issue that immigration has is that people don't understand it. The education on this issue, and it's incredibly difficult. You know, my boss would go into a town hall, and to go from border security to guest worker programs to dealing with the dreamers to dealing with the undocumented, it would take him 8 to 10 minutes. And that's a long time to try to get people to listen. It's not something you can put in a commercial or in a tweet, right? At the end of the day, immigration is very complex. And there, like I said, I am not an expert on this. I worked on the issue for 10 years, and I'm probably, among Republicans in particular, really up there. But I'm going to call Rachel when I've got a question about how to deal with a court issue. I think that education is number one, and we have to figure out how to do that better because it's difficult. But I also think roving vote coalitions are important, and we were having this discussion in the green room too. There was a bill that just passed in the House that was it fixed your agriculture guest worker program. It had a legalization component for ag workers. It also had an enforcement component with E-Verify provisions in it. To me, that's a model of how to do immigration reform moving forward, taking these chunks and moving them one at a time. You had 34 Republicans support that bill in the House. Those were ag Republicans, right? They came from ag-heavy districts. So Indiana, I bet if you went and talked to your farmers, I know when I talked to my folks in Wisconsin, you know, about when it comes to getting labor on your farms, they are 100% there with you, and you do have some room to move. For so long, we've done comprehensive bills, these big, heavy bills that are supposed to give everybody a reason to vote yes. At the end of the day, they give everybody a reason to vote no. If we can do these roving vote coalitions, so my ag guys might not necessarily vote for my H-1B high skill guest worker program, but I bet I can get a chunk of other people who've got some interest in their district that are interested in dealing with that problem. So if we can find the bipartisanship on different issues that way, I think that's a good way to move forward on this.
Just say quickly
Yeah,
something
please,
on
and then we'll go over
because
there.
I just think
Please go
that
ahead.
one thing we can't ignore, this did not always used to be a partisan issue. I mean, the 65 Act, which I said ended the national origin quota, there were more Republicans who voted for that bill than Democrats. We passed a major 86 legislation, Lenny Benson. President Reagan signed that bill. There was a huge bipartisan. All I can tell you one fact about this, why it has changed. In the beginning of this century, actually there were fewer people in this country who thought immigration was a huge net plus for the country. Today, about 65% of Americans believe that immigration is really good for the country. But the divide between Democrats and Republicans on that is huge. In 1990, equal number of Democrats or Republicans thought immigration was good or bad. Beginning in 1990, it has become much more polarized since 2005. There are many more Democrats who believe immigrants are good and many more Republicans who believe immigrants are not good. The spread now is about 45%. Wow. That explains almost everything. That if you are running for a primary seat in Republican, if you are pro-immigrant, you're toast. On the other hand, if you are a Democrat and if you're not intensely pro-immigrant, you're toast. Yeah. And that's sort of where a lot of the polarization today comes from. Yeah.
I want to take one more question from over there. I'm sorry, because we have one more panel. We're only going to be able to take one more question from this panel, but we have another panel after this. So sit back down, and I'll be here afterwards if I have any. I don't know if I can answer any questions, but maybe. Yes, what's your question?
So you talked a lot about the polarization of this issue and how the polarization, that gap has grown over years. I know from my own personal experience, the people that I talk to that are against immigration are generally against it in like this grand scheme. Oh, I'm Republican, I'm against immigration. But when you get down to the nuts and bolts of the people who are actually affected, we talk about things like DACA, or the 4.1 million U.S. born citizens with parents who are undocumented. You talk about these people and you bring it back down to a more humanitarian level. A lot of the Republicans who tell me that they're against immigration are like, oh, well, those people, yeah, I'm totally about that. Or even, you've talked about these small bills that are being passed for these more bipartisan groups. How do we bring this grand issue of immigration, and how do we bridge this divide when at the end of the day, I think there is a lot more commonality in the humanitarian aspects than we would like to believe, because it's become so polarized?
That's a great question. Is anybody?
Well, I mean, you said it yourself. I mean, if anyone knows an immigrant, they're pro-immigrant by nature. Seriously, if you know your professor, if you know your caregiver, if you know your nurse in the hospital, you're pro-immigrant. I mean, when we're talking about education, part of the education is to introduce immigrants to people. And I think this is going to change hugely in the care industry. If we know any of our grandparents, parents who need care these days, you could always be sure it's an immigrant giving them that care. Just talk to them about it. Look, if we didn't have immigrants, who would be doing this job? I think sort of personalizing it for people, I think makes a lot of difference.
Well, that is a perfect segue to our next panel. Thank you all very much. Really appreciate it. Thanks for the time.
That's great. Thank you.
So our next panel, as Moose was saying, in this immigration debate today, the conversation about immigrants is often consumed by talk from politicians and pundits. And when we do hear from immigrants, it's generally those trying to get into the country, maybe at our southern border. So we wanted to devote the rest of this program to immigrants who have become activists in their own right. And in that way, they are steeped in these issues from the personal to the policy. So we'll also have a chance for audience questions after this as well. So please welcome to the stage Dafe Akporo and Carolina Fung Feng. So I first met Dafe at a place called The Lighthouse in Jersey City, which was a shelter for asylum seekers who are released from detention and have no place to go. And that's similar to what Dafe's personal experience was. He was born in Nigeria, and he came to the U.S. after facing persecution as a gay man and for advocating for the rights of those with HIV/AIDS. As soon as he declared asylum at JFK Airport, he was shackled at the hands, at the waist, and at the feet, and he was jailed at the Elizabeth Detention Center. Dafe would ultimately win asylum and write a memoir about his experience called Bed 26. That book was also turned into a theatrical production, and he's now the executive director of RDJ Refugee Shelter in Harlem, where 10 men, refugees, and asylum seekers are housed. Welcome, Dafe. Thank you for being here.
And next to me is Carolina Fung Feng. She's a DACA recipient. Her parents are Chinese, and she came with them from Costa Rica to New York when she was 12 years old and grew up in Washington Heights. She was already in college when DACA was created in 2012, but even though she was in college already, the program still enabled her to work legally, and she now holds a job at a public library in Brooklyn where she helps adults who didn't finish their high school degrees. And Carolina was one of the plaintiffs in the lawsuit to keep DACA that went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. And she even marched from New York to Washington, D.C., which is how I first spoke with her, because I interviewed her while she was marching for our WNYC newscasts. And we would like to welcome you both tonight. It is very important that we do see the people who are affected by this. You know, you guys were saying this is maybe where we can get people to agree on things if they know each other. And I'd really love to know, first of all, from each of you, what you thought of the panel that we just heard from, because you were sitting in back, watching, listening. Did you have any reactions to some of the proposals that were talked about? And the bipartisan way that things go in Washington. You give a little, you got to get a little.
For me personally, I feel like I shouldn't have to give up something just to get my basic human rights of being allowed to stay here. This is where I grew up and I belong here. And so do the other 11 million undocumented immigrants that live in this country. I was one of the lucky few who was able to apply for DACA and still have DACA. Because right now DACA is functioning under, I would say, a limited way. And so it's only allowing for people who currently have DACA to be able to renew. And I think that's unfair because there are a lot of like people who qualify for DACA, but they just can't apply for their initial DACA application. So they were left out and excluded. And it also leaves out our parents who worked very hard to brought us here to give us the opportunities that we have now. And why should, they argue about what kind of compromises they need to make in order to bring forward a humane and comprehensive immigration reform? They should think about what's happening to us. We are all human. We have the freedom to move from one country to another to seek better opportunities because that's just our nature as human beings.
So in your mind, to hear people talk about political compromise where, okay, let's deal with DACA and then deal with other pieces of it later, to you that seems impossible because you feel like they have to include more issues with that, such as making it possible for your parents to stay.
Yeah.
You don't see a way to compromise and do one thing at a time.
Yes, because DACA is just a temporary relief for us. It's just a bandage. I have to renew my permit every 2 years, quote unquote, which is not really true. Every time I have to renew, they say between 120 to 150 days before my work permit expires. And because of the unclear situation that we're in now, I don't even know when the Supreme Court is gonna make a decision on DACA. I don't know if I'm gonna be able to keep my job and support my family, pay my rent, pay for food, and go back to school and, continue my education. And that's like unstable for me. I have to keep thinking about, okay, I can't plan long term. I have to think like short term, like, okay. I just recently renewed my DACA last year and I lost 4 months. We are encouraging a lot of people to renew their DACA even if they still have a year left on their work permit, just because we don't know what the situation is gonna look like past June. I don't know when the judges are gonna make a decision. It could be favorable to us or it could be unfavorable to us. And so we have to be prepared for all kinds of scenarios right now. I have to mentally prepare myself for like, if it's a bad situation, I'm gonna lose my job. I have to save enough money to keep me alive for the next year until I can figure out what I'm gonna do next. And I know I'm not alone in this situation, that there are other community organizations out there who are going to support me and help me with everything that I need. So that's one of the reasons why I'm not afraid to sue the government and demand for my basic human rights.
I was going to ask about that. If you, in this climate, is it hard to be an immigrant doing advocacy work? Do either of you feel like it's scary because we've heard so much about immigrants being afraid? And then how do you talk to people who don't share your views, perhaps?
I will start with the reaction to the panel that we hear before us. It was a very good panel, and I congratulate them for the work they do. But there's one thing too often about immigrants, and it's just funny. When we come to this country, we have to work very hard to be recognized and be grateful that you are given a status. and be grateful for it, because you are among one of those few that are granted a status. If you dare step out of the line, you will be treated in a way that will teach the others that you don't dare step out of the line. So the love that is shown to us is conditional to how grateful we can be and how hardworking we can show. And why do we have to show that we are hardworking? To prove to have a status. There's often this conversation that economically is affecting America, that more immigrants have to come here economically so that they can work in farms. If there was no shortage in the amount of workers in farms, we don't need you here. So why should it be conditional to things like who we work in our farms, or how will the GDP of the economy be determined? Why are those factors used in determining who will come to this country? But when Europeans were coming to this country in 1950 after the World War II, they didn't determine who will come based on those same quotas, because we are people of color. Immigration is built as a racist system that is meant to use to warn us. Don't say a word. If you say a word, your green card will be delayed, to teach other immigrants that you shouldn't step out of the line. When I came here as an immigrant in 2016, I said I wasn't going to do anything that has to do with activism anymore. But I steadily see over and over again that if I keep quiet because I'm afraid that I'm going to be punished, what will be the fate of others who cannot stand? So it's often this conversation is not either or. Polarity exists in our society. So if we're going to be polarized, people that stand for immigrants should stand for immigrants with the polarity and stand for it no matter what. Often, if you see the Proud Boys and people who stand for Republicans, they do it proudly. So if you support immigrants and somebody is having a conversation on a table and is saying something wrong about immigrants, why can't you, that have seen an immigrant that hasn't caused problem in your society, say that I know this immigrant and they don't cause problem in our society? The failure of the system is caused by all of us, because the leaders we choose is showing the character of the people who live in the country. And that is the conversation we should be having in 2020. How can we choose leaders that reflect our character?
The conversation, though, about immigrants, I'm curious how you hear it. I hear it often from one side that they're a danger, that they're a threat, that they're changing the culture. And the other side of that, the retort to that, is not nearly as vocal. Is that what you hear and how you absorb the news from Washington about this issue?
I'm tired of watching the news because the news is so obsessed with Trump and they don't report on anything that really matters. I live in New York City. Many of you live in New York, New Jersey. You don't know that there's a detention center a few blocks from our houses. I run a refugee shelter in Harlem. And I'll tell you the story of somebody that died in the shelter in December. I remembered Raul was released from Hudson County Detention Center and was brought to the shelter. When he came that evening from the detention center, he was telling me that I used to live in America for about 10 years. I was arrested. He took my green card. Now I stayed in jail for about 2 years. I'm being released now. I just want to get my life going. He was so enthusiastic about what he would be able to do. But that evening, he complained that he's feeling some pain in his lungs or something. So I took him to Mount Sinai. When he got to Mount Sinai the next morning, the nurse said he cannot return back to the shelter because he has issues with blood sugar. And from blood sugar one day to pain in his head and pain in his back and eyes pain, and 4 days' time, he was dead. Nobody knows of this story. But immigration system use poor or substantial healthcare system. That was why it wasn't afforded the care it needed. Nobody know of that. But we hear every day about the trial of Trump and everything, and forget about people that are dying in Varick Street or Immigration Center in Elizabeth Detention Center where I was detained. And these stories are more important and pertinent to our locality. We need to start focusing on things we can control and not things that we cannot control. 4 years from now, the Trump impeachment trial will be written in books. We will all read it. We will all watch all these things over and over again. Why obsessing over something we cannot change instead of focus on how to change the lives of immigrants in 2020 and vote people that will ensure that these immigrants are protected? How many of you know here the amount of people that are detained in New Jersey, or the court that is just right across the street here? I do my immigration checking here. How many people know of these things? There are things that are happening around us. People need volunteers to escort immigrants to cases, court cases, volunteer for non-profit organization. You might know how to write grants or do budgets, or you might know how to schedule a PowerPoint presentation for a local non-profit. Instead of whining and going over and over again, go and volunteer for them, hear their stories, and know the struggles they go through. Inclusion is the most important thing we can do. And how we can include people is when we see that new immigrants come into this country, we make them part of our lives and let them know that you are not alone. I hear you. I see you. I believe in you. With all the things you are going through, I still want to support you. That is more important than fighting Trump, which you cannot win that battle. It's out of your control. So I hear stories every day about immigrants who are struggling to live a better life. My first job was in Eat Off Beats, 69 Charlton Street. We have our office in this same building. We employ more than 25 refugees here in New York City that are chefs from their home countries, and they prepare food here, and people in New York City buy those foods. Nobody know of these stories.
We reported that.
Yeah.
It was on. I did it on WNYC.
So I used to work for Eat Off Beat. So when we think about how to change the conversation or change the narrative, learn about refugees that are living in New York City. Because when you hear somebody's story, it changes your perception of that person. And when you hear somebody's story and you don't act, it bothers you. So that is something we should be doing, learning how to integrate those people that are here into our society.
We have time for one question from the audience for our guests. Does anybody have a question you'd like to ask these guys? Before
I saw a hand go up.
yes, ma'am.
Yes, is it all right if I speak from here?
Sure. If we can. We're going to get you a mic, actually. Personally delivered.
I appreciate it. It was a beautiful presentation, and I think, isn't that horrible? But I know people who are new immigrants who have come from Western Eastern Europe, and they are going to vote for Trump because Trump is going to change, and it's just bizarre. And I know a lot of these people, and from other places, they are going to vote for Trump because he is going to stop all this giveaway program. That's how they read this, because they think of the Afro-American or the African descent people have been given a lot, and they know how to work the system. But these people, and many are from Eastern Europe, grew up under the communism, and they got good education. They all come here with some kind of big-time skill. They can get jobs, and they also had wonderful health care. So they had all these advantages, and I just can't believe them.
So maybe the question for you guys is
what about this kind of thinking?
Well, maybe it's how would you speak to somebody like that?
Have
Maybe
you
a
met
new
people?
immigrant who thinks that the door should proverbially close behind them.
Yeah.
What would you say to folks like that?
Have you ever had those conversations even?
So I would say, based on my experience, when I came to America at the beginning, I thought that people who were poor were not hardworking. It's a perception I had, because everything I thought about America was like I owed America to high esteem. not until I discovered that systems are built to oppress people. And people who are homeless or people who are poor is not by choice, it's by design. That capitalism has been built to show you that there's a matrix to determine success, and that black people are not hardworking enough is a racial binary way of thinking that bigots think that black people are not hardworking enough, and that is why they are poor. If you look at the people that are poor, majority of them, their fathers do not have the opportunity to store up wealth for them to inherit those wealth, to be able to build a system for their generation to inherit. People like myself who migrate as first-generation immigrants from Nigeria, we are told that we have to work as twice or as thrice as hard as a white person to be able to be seen or heard. But this is something I have adopted for myself, to have a better mental health, that I can do it, but I choose not to do it. Because those people who are going me to do it do not have to do it. So why should I show them that I have to do it? So for you to have a better mental health is, don't argue with a bigot. You can't change them. Humans don't change. Tell them the stories you know. And if they choose to change, fine. But it's not your responsibility to change people, but it's your responsibility to tell them your story. And that is only what I can do.
Do you agree? Have you gotten into conversations with people, maybe not as civil as the ones here tonight, but have you gotten into conversations with people who have raised to you some of the talking points or some of the things that they firmly believe, that they don't think that there's enough jobs for Americans and that there should not be more immigrants because maybe they're taking jobs from them, or that they may be changing their communities? I'm thinking of the reasons why in that the demographics that we saw was so striking to me, that there are states where you can see having a lot of immigrants would be a big shock to people. They're not used to it, like in New York, where the change hasn't been as much over time. So I just wanted to hear your conversations with people and what you say to them.
Yeah, I agree with what he said, and I've had difficult conversations with them too. I try not to argue with them. I just listen to what they have to say so that I can get a better idea of why they think like that. And then I just share my experiences with them, and I ask them if they know anyone in their lives who are immigrants, who struggle and who have to work twice as hard as anybody else. I had a friend, and we were talking about applying for work, and we applied for the same position, but she got called instead of me. And just because she is a U.S. citizen and, she doesn't have a college degree like I do, but she's a citizen. And they call her and they offer her the job, but she turned it down just because she didn't feel like doing it anymore. And I got really upset about that, because I have to put in more work and show my worth in order for someone to give me a job. And I have the education, I have the expertise, I have the qualifications, but they just won't give it to me because I'm undocumented, or because I'm not white, because I'm Asian. And also, they just look at me and they see me and they don't automatically think that I can speak English. The first thing they'll ask me is, what country are you from? And do you speak English? It's like why? Why do you have to ask those questions? I'm like, if just because I'm not born in this country, I don't know, it just doesn't make sense, and it's upsetting, but that's what it is, and I just have to learn to not internalize that and thrive in my own way.
Thanks.
Yeah,
Thanks.
thank you.
Thanks to you both.
Thanks to all of you as well for coming tonight. I'm sorry we have to wrap it up, because we could certainly have a lot more questions and a really great conversation with everyone tonight. Matt and I are reporters on WNYC's immigration team, and we just wanted to put a little plug for that, because we, along with our colleague Arun Venugopal, are going to continue telling these stories and reporting on things throughout the rest of the year, of course. And you can follow us on Twitter and send us ideas. feedback, share our work. Our editor is Julianne Welby, who helped put this event together with producer Cameron Tompkins. And we want to give a big thanks to the crew of the Green Space. And, stay in touch, stay in dialogue with each other and with your friends. And let's see if any of these bipartisan solutions will ever come to fruition.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.